Drop us directly into the tension of July 2013. Introduce the stakes of solitary confinement, the SHU, and the infamous debriefing policy. Show the scale and desperation of the strike. Build toward a cliffhanger with the first fatalities, media attention, and political pressure. Starving for freedom. Like, comment, subscribe, because some stories the system wanted buried forever. But tonight, we're dragging them into the light. The summer sun beat down on Crescent City, California, but inside Pelican Bay State Prison, the air was heavy with silence. It wasn't the usual silence of concrete and steel, the kind imposed by locked doors and fluorescent hum. This was a different silence. A deliberate silence. The sound of thousands of men refusing to eat. On July 8, 2013, California awoke to headlines that seemed unthinkable. Over 30,000 inmates across the state had joined a coordinated hunger strike. At the heart of it all was Pelican Bay, the Supermax fortress carved into the Redwood Coast, where men lived and died in the notorious Security Housing Unit, or SHU. These weren't just ordinary inmates skipping a meal. This was a rebellion without fists or weapons. It was bodies turning against themselves, day by day, in an act of collective desperation. 4 men who had been locked in solitary confinement for decades, food was the last form of control they had left. And they chose to surrender it. The tombs of Pelican Bay. To understand why thousands starved themselves, you have to understand the SHU. A windowless concrete box. 8 feet by 10. A steel door with a slot just wide enough to slide in a food tray. No phone calls. No contact visits. No programs. For 23 hours a day, you were alone with the hum of the light above you and the pounding of your own heart. Prison officials claimed the SHU was for the worst of the worst, gang leaders, violent offenders, men too dangerous to mix with the general population. But the reality was far darker. Inside Pelican Bay, hundreds of men had been kept in solitary not for violence, but for alleged gang affiliation. And the way the prison system determined affiliation was through the debriefing policy. If you wanted out of solitary, you had to inform, snitch on others, provide names, prove your loyalty was broken. For many, that was a death sentence. To debrief meant betraying your gang, your friends, your cellmates, and to betray in prison meant blood. So men stayed silent. And the silence cost them decades of their lives. Some had spent 20, even 30 years in the SHU, their minds unraveling in the concrete tombs. Hallucinations, paranoia, suicide attempts. Human rights organizations called it torture. The state called it security. The spark. By 2011, inmates had already tried to resist. A smaller hunger strike erupted that year, led by prisoners in the Pelican Bay SHU. They issued 5 core demands. End group punishment and administrative abuse. Abolish the debriefing policy. Comply with U.S. recommendations on solitary confinement. Provide adequate food. Expand constructive programs and privileges for SHU inmates. That strike had rattled the system. It spread to other prisons and forced California's Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, into negotiations. Promises were made. Small concessions were offered. More calendars, more photos, the right to purchase beanies to keep warm in freezing cells. But the big issues, solitary and debriefing, remained untouched. By 2013, frustration had boiled over. This time, the strike wouldn't just be Pelican Bay. It would be statewide. Day 1. On the morning of July 8th, trays of oatmeal and milk cartons slid into cells across California. At Pelican Bay's SHU, most trays sat untouched. By nightfall, word spread from Crescent City to San Quentin, from Folsom to Corcoran. Tens of thousands of inmates were refusing food. This wasn't chaos. It was calculated. Letters smuggled out of Pelican Bay had laid out the plan, coordinated by men in solitary cells with no direct contact. Through legal mail, coded messages, and the fragile lifeline of prison communication, they had organized a rebellion that swept across the state like wildfire. By the end of the first week, nearly 30,000 prisoners were participating. It was the largest hunger strike in California history. Breaking point. The CDCR downplayed it at first. Officials called it a disturbance, claiming most inmates would give up within days. They treated the protest as a power play by gangs, dismissing it as manipulation. But as the days dragged on, the numbers didn't collapse. Thousands kept refusing food. At Pelican Bay, men wasted away in their cells. Guards carried out limp bodies, eyes sunken, ribs showing. Medical staff begged the administration to act. Families outside held vigils. Mothers and wives marched at the state capitol, holding photos of their loved ones. Sons who hadn't felt the sun in decades, fathers whose voices they hadn't heard except through glass. Media outlets began circling. The New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the New Yorker. Stories of men locked alone for 20 years started to reach living rooms across America. And then came the first death. Billy Guero cell. On July 22, 2013, after 2 weeks without food, inmate Billy Michael Guero cell was found unresponsive in his SHU cell at Corcoran State Prison. Cell, 32 years old, had been serving a life sentence for attempted murder. The state called it a suicide. Inmates called it murder by neglect. Cell had reportedly requested medical attention days earlier, but guards ignored his pleas. His death became a rallying cry. If the hunger strike hadn't been visible before, it was now undeniable. Human rights groups declared that California was risking lives by refusing to address the inmates' demands. Legislators demanded hearings. The world was watching. A system under siege. By week 3, pressure mounted on Sacramento. Governor Jerry Brown stayed largely silent, but behind closed doors the administration scrambled. They feared conceding would embolden gangs. But letting men die on national television wasn't an option either. Inside Pelican Bay, the mood shifted from determination to desperation. Some inmates began collapsing, unable to stand. Others were placed on 4 fluids against their will. Prison officials threatened disciplinary action, taking away visits, stripping privileges, extending SHU terms. But still men refused food. For the first time, the walls of Pelican Bay weren't containing the story. They were amplifying it. The hunger strike was no longer just a prison protest. It was a test of how far the state would go to preserve control, and how much suffering inmates were willing to endure to be seen as human. On the 40th day of the strike, reports leaked that several men had been moved to outside hospitals, their bodies skeletal, their lives hanging by a thread. Families demanded intervention. Lawmakers threatened investigations. And then in late August, after nearly 60 days without food, a group of inmates, emaciated, trembling, barely able to speak, released a statement from Pelican Bay. They weren't backing down. We are prepared to die if that's what it takes. This is not about gangs. This is about being treated as human beings. The strike had started as a protest, but it was quickly becoming a standoff that could end in mass death, political scandal, and the collapse of California's prison system. And behind the locked doors of Pelican Bay, rumors swirled. The state wasn't preparing to negotiate. It was preparing to break them. The battle for humanity. The heat of the summer bore down on California, but inside Pelican Bay, time was measured not in days but in meals refused. By the end of July 2013, thousands of trays of food had gone untouched. At first, guards had laughed, betting on how long the inmates would last. By now the laughter was gone. The men were skeletal. Their eyes sunken, skin gray. Some had lost 25, even 30 pounds. The smell of vomit, weakness, and slow decay clung to the concrete air. Every step echoed with the sound of bodies failing. And still they refused to eat. This wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a war between survival and dignity. A state under pressure. By day 20, the headlines were unavoidable. The New York Times, The Guardian, Los Angeles Times, and even international outlets were covering the hunger strike. Television news showed families outside prisons with handmade signs: "End torture, stop solitary, we want our sons alive." Legislators couldn't ignore it. State Senator Lonnie Hancock and Assemblyman Tom Amiano called for hearings, accusing the Department of Corrections of violating basic human rights. You cannot keep men locked in concrete boxes for decades and expect them to remain silent, Hancock told reporters. But Governor Jerry Brown's administration struck a different tone. His staff dismissed the strike as gang manipulation. Secretary Jeffrey Beard of the CDCR wrote op-eds insisting that ending solitary would give gangs too much power, that debriefing was necessary to dismantle criminal networks. It was a battle of narratives: torture versus security, humanity versus control. Inside the SHU cells were never meant for long-term living. Fluorescent lights buzzed 24/7. The air was stale, the walls smeared with graffiti etched by men who had lost track of years. Prisoners wrote letters on scraps of toilet paper, smuggled out through attorneys and family members. One described seeing shadow figures after weeks without food. Another admitted he could no longer remember his mother's face. And yet they stayed unified. The hunger strike had grown from the 5 core demands written 2 years earlier, but now it was something bigger. It was a demand for recognition, a cry against a system that buried people alive in isolation. The first death echoes. When Billy Michael Guero's cell was found dead in Corcoran's SHU on July 22, the prison system called it suicide. Inmates who shared adjacent cells said otherwise. Cell had been begging for medical care, complaining of chest pain, but guards ignored him. His death ignited fury. Families rallied at the Capitol. Civil rights groups declared that California had blood on its hands. The words "Justice for Guero" appeared in graffiti outside Los Angeles, in letters mailed from inside prisons and on banners waved by protesters. For the men starving in Pelican Bay, Cell's death was proof of what they already knew. This strike could kill them, but the silence was worse. The outside world joins in. By August, the strike had lasted more than 30 days. Some inmates were down to little more than bone and skin. Prison doctors warned of irreversible organ failure. Families outside called for emergency intervention. Supporters formed human chains in Sacramento, chanting, "No justice, no peace, no torture in our state." Faith leaders called for compassion. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture received urgent appeals. Inside the prison, some men collapsed on their concrete floors. Others were taken to outside hospitals, shackled to beds as 4 drips forced fluids into their veins. Guards patrolled like soldiers, their faces tense, knowing they were witnessing history but powerless to stop it. The state strikes back. By day 40, CDCR made its move. Prison officials filed for permission to force-feed inmates. In their filings, they argued that many prisoners were being coerced by gangs into starving. They framed the act of inserting feeding tubes as a way to protect life. But for the inmates, force-feeding was the ultimate betrayal. To them, it was an assault, strapping them down, jamming tubes through their noses into their stomachs, violating the one form of protest they still controlled. Attorneys for the prisoners rushed to court, arguing that the men were of sound mind, that they had chosen this sacrifice. But the courts sided with the state. Force-feeding was authorized. And so, men who had not tasted food in 6 weeks found themselves restrained in medical chairs, their ribs jutting, their lips cracked as liquid nutrition was pumped into their bodies against their will. The political firestorm. The strike had reached Sacramento's halls of power. Lawmakers grilled corrections officials in hearings broadcast across the state. Families packed the galleries, holding up photos of loved ones wasting away. One lawmaker asked bluntly, "How do you justify holding men in solitary confinement for 20 years? The CDCR's answer was simple: security. They argued that gangs like the Nuestra Familia, Mexican Mafia, and Aryan Brotherhood used Pelican Bay as their headquarters, ordering hits, extortion, and drug trafficking. Solitary, they claimed, was the only way to break their grip. But human rights experts countered with evidence. They showed cases where men had been thrown in the SHU not for violence, but for drawings, books, or even birthday cards with Aztec symbols, evidence of gang affiliation. Some had been locked away based only on another inmate's debriefing testimony. The truth was undeniable. California was burying men alive, sometimes for life, without ever charging them with a new crime. Breaking down. By day 50, desperation was reaching a peak. Inmates wrote last letters to their families, hands trembling too weak to hold pens. One man scrawled, "I want my children to know I didn't give up. I died a man, not a number." Medical reports showed irreversible muscle loss, organ strain, failing eyesight. Even some correctional officers began whispering doubts. One guard told a reporter anonymously, "They say they're monsters. But when you see a man starving himself for dignity, you can't unsee that." The strike had begun as an inmate rebellion. Now it was a mirror held up to the entire state of California. On September 5, 2013, after nearly 60 days without food, the leaders of the strike, men who had spent half their lives in the SHU, were brought to Sacramento in shackles to testify. Emaciated, pale, their voices weak, they told lawmakers what the prison system had hidden for decades: that solitary confinement was not safety. It was slow death. Legislators listened. Cameras rolled. And for the first time, the possibility of reform seemed real. But outside the chambers, corrections officials whispered of new lockdowns. The CDCR wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. The men had brought their bodies to the edge of death. The question was, would the state finally listen, or would it let them die in silence? The 60th day. By early September 2013, the hunger strike had stretched on for 2 months. Thousands had dropped out, forced back into eating by weakness, threats, or medical intervention. But at Pelican Bay, the core group, the men who had spent decades in solitary, remained unbroken. They were skeletons wrapped in prison blues. Some could no longer walk to the door slot to accept water. Their skin clung to their bones, lips cracked, eyes glazed. Guards carried stretchers into the SHU. Nurses whispered about organ failure. Doctors warned that permanent brain damage was imminent. And still the men refused food. The strike was no longer about bargaining. It was about legacy. They wanted the world to know that they had chosen to die on their own terms, rather than live buried in concrete. The Capitol confrontation. On September 5th, in a scene that shook Sacramento, several strike leaders were escorted under heavy guard into a state legislative hearing. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, their bodies frail, they addressed lawmakers directly. They didn't shout. Their voices were hoarse, barely above whispers. But the words cut deeper than any riot ever could. We are human beings. We are not animals to be locked in cages for decades. We will starve to prove our point if we must. Families sobbed in the gallery. Lawmakers sat in silence. The television cameras broadcast their testimony across the nation. For the first time, the men who had been hidden in the SHU for 20 years were visible to the world. The state's dilemma. Governor Jerry Brown faced the pressure of a lifetime. On one side, human rights advocates, families, and lawmakers demanded change. On the other, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation insisted that ending long-term solitary would unleash chaos, giving gangs free rein. Corrections Secretary Jeffrey Beard accused the strike's leaders of being gang shot callers, manipulating the protest to strengthen their control. But the public was no longer convinced. Too many stories had leaked out, of men locked away for drawings, for political writings, for association rather than action. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture weighed in, declaring that more than 15 days of solitary confinement constituted cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. Pelican Bay's decades-long isolation was torture on a global stage. The moral crisis collided with the political one. If Brown's administration let men die, California would be shamed before the world. If they gave in, they risked looking weak before the prison guards union and conservative voters. Time was running out. The breaking point. By day 59, reports emerged that multiple strikers were near death. Attorneys visiting clients described men unable to stand, their hearts faltering, vision blurring. On September 5th, attorneys and advocates met with the core strike leaders at Pelican Bay. They begged them to stop, warning that another week could mean mass fatalities. The leaders listened. They were gaunt, barely able to lift their heads. But they had achieved something extraordinary. They had forced the state to listen. On September 6, 2013, after 59 days, the leaders announced the suspension of the hunger strike. They hadn't won everything. Solitary confinement still existed. The debriefing policy wasn't abolished overnight. But they had cracked the walls of Pelican Bay, exposing its darkness to the world. The reforms. The strike didn't vanish into silence. It ignited lawsuits, hearings, and eventually change. In 2015, the landmark settlement in Ashker versus Governor of California effectively ended indefinite solitary confinement in California. Thousands of inmates were transferred out of the SHU. The step-down program was introduced, creating a path out of isolation without forcing inmates to debrief. By 2017, the number of people held in California's SHUs had dropped by more than 80%. It wasn't a complete victory. Solitary confinement still exists, sometimes abused. But for the first time in decades, Pelican Bay's concrete tombs weren't filling up with men destined to rot there forever. The human cost. Not all the strikers survived. Some never recovered their health. Others were scarred by irreversible damage, muscle wasting, weakened hearts, psychological trauma. Families described fathers who came home unrecognizable, sons who spoke like strangers after decades in isolation. And the memory of Billy Michael Guero cell haunted the movement. His death during the strike remained a symbol of the stakes, proof that the state was willing to let men die rather than concede. His name is still spoken by activists fighting solitary today. Legacy. The 2013 California hunger strike remains one of the largest prison hunger strikes in U.S. history. At its peak, 30,000 inmates refused food. It shook the foundation of the prison system and sparked national debates on human rights, punishment, and dignity. Pelican Bay is still there, looming on the foggy coast of Crescent City. Its SHU units still hold men in isolation. But the strike changed the narrative forever. The inmates proved that even buried in concrete, voices could rise. Even starved bodies could resist. Even in the darkest prison in America, the demand for humanity could not be silenced. Months after the strike ended, one attorney visited Pelican Bay to check on a former striker. The man, frail but smiling, handed her a folded piece of paper. It wasn't legal notes. It was a poem. Read. We starved not for death, but for the taste of freedom. The state feeds us food, but we were hungry for life. She carried it out of the prison gates. And like the hunger strike itself, those words slipped past the walls, past the barbed wire and into the world. They thought Pelican Bay could bury the hunger strike. Instead, it became a turning point in prison history, a rebellion fought not with weapons but with the emptiness of a plate. And to this day, every time California debates solitary confinement, the echoes of 2013 still linger, whispering from the cells where men once starved themselves to prove they were human.